It was a typical Friday night in our quiet suburban neighborhood. My wife, Laura, and I had just put our 2 children, Emma and Jake, to bed. The house was finally silent after a long day of work, school, and the usual hustle and bustle of family life. We settled on the couch to watch a movie, savoring a rare moment of peace. As the movie played, I found myself unable to shake a strange feeling of unease. It was as if someone was watching us, though I knew that was impossible. Our house was securely locked, and the neighborhood was known for its low crime rate. Still, the sensation persisted, gnawing at the back of my mind. "Are you okay, James?" Laura asked, noticing my distraction. "Yeah, just a bit tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's been a long week." We continued watching the movie, but my mind kept drifting. I glanced at the windows, checking to make sure they were closed and locked. Everything seemed fine, yet the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Around midnight, Laura and I decided to call it a night. We turned off the TV and headed upstairs. As we reached the top of the stairs, I heard a faint noise coming from the back of the house. It sounded like a window creaking open. My heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Laura, who nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I motioned for her to stay with the kids while I went to investigate. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under our bed for emergencies and crept down the stairs, my senses on high alert. The house was dark and eerily quiet. I moved towards the kitchen, where the noise had come from. As I reached the doorway, I saw a shadow moving across the floor. My grip tightened on the bat as I stepped into the kitchen. The back door was wide open, and the cool night air was blowing in. Panic surged through me. I flicked on the lights, but there was no one there. I quickly shut the door and locked it, double-checking all the windows and doors on the ground floor. Everything seemed secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I went back upstairs to find Laura waiting for me with a worried expression. "Someone was in the house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But they're gone now." I locked all the doors and windows. Laura nodded, her face pale. "Should we call the police?" I hesitated. "I think it's best if we do, just to be safe." We called the police, and 2 officers arrived within minutes. They searched the house and the surrounding area but found no signs of forced entry or any indication of an intruder. They assured us that it was probably just a one-time incident and advised us to be vigilant that night. I hardly slept. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump, and I found myself constantly checking on the kids. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved that nothing had happened. I hoped it was just a random occurrence and that life would return to normal. A few days passed without incident, and the sense of unease began to fade. I was starting to convince myself that it had all been a product of my imagination. But then, one night, everything changed. Laura and I were asleep when I was jolted awake by a loud crash coming from downstairs. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Laura stirred beside me, her eyes opening in confusion. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I grabbed the baseball bat again and cautiously made my way down the stairs. As I reached the bottom, I saw that the living room window had been shattered. Glass littered the floor, and the cold night air was streaming in. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, raising the bat, and came face to face with a man dressed in black. His face was partially obscured by a hood, and he was holding a crowbar. His eyes were filled with a menacing intensity. "Get out of my house!" I shouted, my voice shaking with fear and anger. The intruder didn't respond. Instead, he lunged at me with the crowbar. I swung the bat, but he was quick, dodging the blow and striking me in the side with the crowbar. Pain shot through my ribs as I stumbled back, struggling to catch my breath. Before I could react, he was on me again, swinging the crowbar with brutal force. I raised the bat to block his strikes, but he was relentless. Desperation fueled my movements as I fought to defend myself and protect my family. Laura appeared at the top of the stairs, screaming for help. The intruder glanced up at her, momentarily distracted. Seizing the opportunity, I swung the bat with all my strength, connecting with his shoulder. He cried out in pain and dropped the crowbar. I didn't wait for him to recover. I tackled him to the ground, pinning him down with all my weight. Laura called the police, her voice shaking with fear. The intruder struggled beneath me, but I held on, determined not to let him escape. Within minutes, the police arrived and took the intruder into custody. They praised my bravery, but all I could think about was how close we had come to disaster. The man was identified as a career criminal with a long history of break-ins and violence. He had targeted our house because it was in a quiet neighborhood with little police presence. The police assured us that he would be behind bars for a long time, but the experience had shaken us to our core. Laura and I decided to invest in a security system and reinforced locks, hoping to restore some sense of safety to our home. Despite the increased security measures, the house never felt the same. The memory of the intruder's attack lingered in every room, casting a shadow over our once peaceful home. Emma and Jake were particularly affected, becoming fearful and anxious, often waking up from nightmares. Laura and I tried to reassure them, but we were struggling with our own fear. Every night, I found myself lying awake, listening for any signs of danger. The slightest noise would jolt me out of bed, and I would find myself patrolling the house with a baseball bat in hand. One night, about a month after the attack, I was sitting in the living room, unable to sleep. The house was dark and silent, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I was lost in thought when I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the back door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent. I grabbed the baseball bat and moved quietly toward the kitchen. As I approached the door, the tapping stopped. I stood there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, listening intently. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the door burst open. A figure in black stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the night. Panic surged through me as I raised the bat, ready to defend my home once again. But before I could react, the figure stepped into the light, and I saw his face. It was the same man, the intruder who had attacked us. My blood ran cold. How was this possible? He was supposed to be in jail. He smiled, a cold, sinister grin that sent chills down my spine. "Miss me?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. I didn't wait for him to make the first move. I swung the bat, but he was ready this time. He dodged the blow and grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully. I cried out in pain as the bat fell from my grasp. He shoved me to the ground and kicked me in the ribs, knocking the wind out of me. I struggled to get up, but he was on me, pinning me down with brutal force. I could see the madness in his eyes, a sick pleasure in my suffering. Laura appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale with fear. "Leave us alone," she screamed, but the intruder just laughed. "You're all mine," he said, his voice a low growl. He turned back to me, his grip tightening on my throat. I clawed at his hands, gasping for air, but his strength was overwhelming. Just when I thought I was going to pass out, I heard a loud crash. Emma and Jake had woken up and were standing at the top of the stairs, their eyes wide with terror. Jake, my brave little boy, had thrown a vase at the intruder, hitting him square in the head. The man staggered, momentarily stunned. Seizing the opportunity, I kicked him as hard as I could, knocking him off balance. Laura grabbed the baseball bat and swung it with all her might, hitting him in the side. He He cried out in pain and fell to the ground. The police arrived moments later, alerted by a neighbor who had heard the commotion. They arrested the intruder, and this time, they assured us that he would be locked away for good. We decided to move, hoping a fresh start in a new home would help us heal. We found a cozy house in a nearby town, far from the traumatic memories that haunted our old home. It was smaller but had a warmth to it that we hadn't felt in a long time. But even now, as we settle into our new life, I still find myself listening for any strange noises in the night, still checking the locks before I go to bed. I may never feel completely safe again, but I know one thing for sure. I will do whatever it takes to protect my family, and that, in the end, is what matters most. Working the night shift at a small-town diner had its perks. The regulars, the truckers, and the occasional travelers kept things interesting. My coworker Jenny and I often spent the slow hours chatting and sharing stories. She was a single mom working nights to support her young daughter, and we had become close friends. Our bond was strengthened by the long, quiet nights. One night, around 2:30 a.m., a woman stumbled into the diner. She was disheveled, her clothes torn, and her face bruised. She looked terrified. Jenny and I rushed to her, helping her to a booth and giving her some water. She was shaking, barely able to speak. "Help me," she whispered. "They're after me." Before we could ask her any questions, the door swung open, and two men walked in. They were burly with cold, hard eyes. One of them had a tattoo of a snake on his neck. They scanned the diner, their gazes landing on the woman. She shrank back in her seat, her eyes wide with fear. "Is there a problem here?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. The man with the tattoo sneered at me. "This is none of your business," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "We're just here to take our friend back." Jenny and I exchanged a glance. It was clear the woman didn't want to go with them, but we were just two waitresses against these intimidating men. I tried to stall, asking if they wanted to order something, but they weren't interested in food. They grabbed the woman by the arms and started dragging her out of the booth. Suddenly, she screamed, a blood-curdling sound that made my skin crawl. She broke free from their grip and ran towards the kitchen. Jenny and I tried to block the men, but they were too strong. They shoved us aside and followed her. I ran to the phone to call the police, but before I could dial, I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. Jenny and I rushed back to find the woman lying on the floor, unconscious, with a pool of blood forming around her head. The men were gone, and the back door was wide open. The police arrived within minutes, but it was too late. The woman was dead, and there was no sign of her attackers. The only clue was the snake tattoo. The police took our statements and promised to investigate, but I could tell they didn't have much hope of finding the men. For weeks, the diner felt different. The regulars noticed the change in our demeanor, the lingering fear in our eyes. Jenny and I couldn't shake the memory of that night. Every noise, every shadow made us jump. We started closing the diner earlier, too afraid to stay open all night. One night, a month later, I was closing up alone. Jenny had called in sick, and the diner was empty. As I was locking the front door, I saw a figure standing across the street. My heart skipped a beat. It was the man with the snake tattoo. He was watching me, a sinister smile on his face. I quickly locked the door and ran to the back, my hands shaking. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They assured me they would patrol the area, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he returned. I decided to quit the job. The fear was too much to bear. But even now, months later, I still see his face in my nightmares. The snake tattoo, a constant reminder of the night we couldn't save that woman. I was excited about moving into my new apartment. It was a modern studio on the 13th floor of a high-rise building, and the view of the city lights from my window was breathtaking. The apartment was small but well-designed, with sleek finishes and a cozy minimalist feel. I quickly settled in, eager to start my new chapter in the city. My first week was uneventful. I enjoyed the tranquility of my space and the solitude it provided. However, as I approached the end of my second week, I began to notice strange occurrences. At first, they were minor things, small items that seemed to have shifted positions when I wasn't looking. I dismissed them as the result of my own forgetfulness, or perhaps a bit of paranoia from the stress of moving. It wasn't until one night around 2 a.m. that things took a darker turn. I was jolted awake by the sound of what seemed like footsteps coming from the hallway outside my apartment. It was an unsettling noise, deliberate and heavy, as if someone were walking slowly and methodically. I peered through the peephole in my door, but the hallway was empty. I assumed it was just a neighbor or someone coming home late, but the footsteps continued. They were always at the same time each night, and they always seemed to come from right outside my door. I tried to ignore them, but the constant rhythmic sound became a source of mounting anxiety. My sleep grew fitful, and the sense of being watched became overwhelming. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a faint knock on my door. Startled, I went to open it, but no one was there. I checked the hallway but found it empty. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been a neighbor's prank or a figment of my imagination. The next night, I heard the knock again, but this time it was accompanied by a low, almost inaudible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, as if someone was trying to communicate something sinister. I was on edge, my anxiety escalating with each passing day. Determined to find the source of the disturbances, I decided to set up a small camera near the door to record any unusual activity. That night, I was awoken by the same footsteps, and the whispering returned. I replayed the footage in the morning, hoping to find some explanation. What I saw left me paralyzed with fear. The footage showed me asleep in my bed. The camera, positioned perfectly, captured the outline of my door as well. Around 2 a.m., the hallway outside the door grew darker, and a distinct shadow seemed to materialize. It was a dark, shifting form that moved with an unnatural fluidity. The shadow approached my door, and the knocking began. But what was most disturbing was the figure that emerged from the darkness. The figure was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs and a featureless face. It seemed to move with a jerky, disjointed motion, as if its limbs were not entirely in sync with its body. The figure hovered in front of my door, its shadow stretching and distorting as it twisted unnaturally. The whispers I had heard were more distinct in the video, a series of incoherent, guttural sounds that seemed to echo from the depths of the figure's form. I was terrified. The video made it clear that whatever was outside my door was not a person, but something far more malevolent. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it could have been a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. That night, I heard the footsteps again. The figure's presence was more palpable. Its whispers were louder and more insistent. I was too afraid to leave my apartment, too afraid to confront whatever was outside. The dread grew until I felt like I was suffocating. Desperate for help, I reached out to the building management. They sent a maintenance worker to check the hallway and the surrounding areas, but he found nothing unusual. The building was secure, and the camera footage showed only me, my door, and the occasional shadow passing by. The maintenance worker reassured me that there was nothing to worry about, but his words did little to ease my fear. The disturbances continued, and I began to feel a sense of impending doom. My apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a prison of terror. The whispers grew louder each night, and the shadows seemed to grow more distinct and sinister. One night, as the whispers reached a fever pitch, I mustered the courage to open my door and confront the figure. I flung the door open, expecting to see the shadowy form, but the hallway was empty. The air was cold and oppressive, and the silence was deafening. I stepped into the hallway, but it was as if the darkness had swallowed the figure whole. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances grew more intense. The figure became bolder, the whispers more coherent. I could hear a voice now, a low, raspy tone that seemed to be repeating a single horrifying phrase. "Let me in, let me in." I tried everything to rid myself of the malevolent presence. I used protective charms, sought advice from paranormal experts, and even performed cleansing rituals, but nothing seemed to work. The figure's presence persisted, a dark shadow lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Eventually, I decided to leave the apartment. The fear had become unbearable, and I could no longer endure the nightly torment. I packed my belongings in a frenzy, determined to escape the suffocating grip of the shadow. As I left, I glanced back at the apartment, half expecting to see the figure watching me from the doorway. I moved to a new place, far from the high-rise, hoping to leave the terror behind. But the feeling of dread followed me. The whispers continued, sometimes faint, sometimes clear, always echoing the same chilling words. "Let me in." I've since learned that others who lived in my old apartment reported similar disturbances. Some moved out, others tried to ignore it, but the pattern was the same. An uninvited guest that defied explanation and tormented anyone who dared to stay. The memory of those nights still haunts me. The darkness that seemed to seep into every corner of my life has left a lasting scar. I often wonder if the shadow still lingers in that apartment, waiting for its next occupant, ready to bring its insidious presence into another person's life. To this day, I avoid the high-rise building, and I live with the constant nagging fear that the whispers might one day return. The uninvited guest remains a dark, haunting presence in my life, a reminder of the terror that can lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding.